You feel the sand before you see the sky. Your face is pressed against burning ground, and when you try to lift your head, bronze shackles bite into your wrists with a pain so sharp it steals your breath. Voices speak in a language that sounds like water over stones, beautiful and incomprehensible. Then hands grip your shoulders, forcing you upright, and you see them for the first time. Rows of women chained together like beads on a necklace, their eyes empty in a way that makes you understand this isn't temporary. A soldier approaches carrying something that glows red in the desert heat. You don't know what the hieroglyphs burned into your arm will say, but you understand their meaning perfectly. You are no longer a person. You are inventory. This isn't a nightmare you'll wake from, or a punishment that will end. This is the beginning of a system so thoroughly designed, so meticulously documented, and so completely normalized that it would operate without interruption for 3,000 years. I'm genuinely fascinated by how many of you watch these stories from every corner of our world. If you're comfortable sharing, drop a comment telling me where you are right now, because knowing these histories matter to people in Mumbai and Mexico City and Melbourne makes this work feel less lonely. The year is approximately 1450 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep II, and Egypt stands at the height of its imperial power. Its monuments tower over the ancient world. Its armies dominate 3 continents. Its administrative systems function with a precision that won't be matched for millennia. But beneath the golden surface of temples and the granite faces of gods lies an infrastructure of human suffering so vast and so efficient that modern historians initially refused to believe the evidence preserved in Egypt's own records. The papyri don't lie. The tomb inscriptions don't exaggerate. The administrative documents discovered in the dry sand describe practices that the Egyptians themselves documented with bureaucratic pride, never imagining that future generations would view their accomplishments as evidence of systematic atrocity. Female slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't an unfortunate side effect of warfare or an occasional practice during desperate times. It was a foundational pillar of Egyptian civilization, as essential to their economy as the Nile's annual flood, as integrated into their culture as the worship of Ra. The horror began long before the branding iron touched skin. Egyptian military campaigns into Nubia, Libya, and the Levant were planned with dual objectives: territorial expansion and human acquisition. The victory inscriptions that Amenhotep II ordered carved into temple walls don't just describe battles won or lands conquered. They boast about specific numbers of people captured, categorized, and transported back to Egypt. One inscription preserved at Karnak records with chilling precision: 89,600 people brought away as living captives. But the most revealing detail isn't the number, it's how these human beings were classified. Men were counted separately from women. Women were counted separately from children. The categories weren't random. They reflected the different economic purposes each group would serve in the Egyptian system. Men provided heavy labor. Children could be molded from youth. But women served multiple functions that made them particularly valuable as property. They could work. They could produce sexual services. And most importantly, they could reproduce, creating the next generation of slaves without requiring additional military campaigns. The administrative papyri discovered at sites across Egypt reveal a level of organization that should be impressive if it weren't so horrifying. Scribes maintained detailed inventories of female captives, noting their approximate age, their physical condition, their place of origin, and their assessed value. These weren't casual records. They were systematic catalogs that treated human beings with the same attention that modern corporations apply to asset management. Young women, those between roughly 12 and 25 years old, commanded the highest prices because they represented the longest potential period of exploitation. Officials examined them like livestock at auction, checking their teeth for signs of disease, assessing their physical strength for labor capacity, and evaluating their reproductive potential with a cold pragmatism that viewed pregnancy as a return on investment. The papyrus Harris Firstone, one of the longest surviving papyri from ancient Egypt, contains passages that modern translators struggled to render into English without using words like breeding program and human farming. The document describes how pharaohs organized entire settlements devoted specifically to the production of slave labor. These weren't work camps where captured enemies were temporarily detained. They were permanent institutions designed to turn human reproduction into an industrial process. Women in these facilities existed for a single purpose: to produce children who would be born into slavery, creating a self-perpetuating system that required no external supply chain once established. But before any woman reached these breeding facilities, she had to survive the journey that was itself designed to break human spirits. The march from Nubia or the Levant to Egypt could take weeks or months, depending on the distance and the season. Women were chained together in long columns, connected by bronze or copper links that bit into their ankles with every step. Those who fell were sometimes dragged by the moving column until they either regained their footing or were cut loose and left to die in the desert. Egyptian military records mention these losses with the same tone they used to describe damaged equipment: unfortunate but acceptable given the scale of the operation. The women who survived arrived at their destinations already transformed by trauma. Many had watched their families killed during the initial raids. They had been separated from their children, who were categorized and transported separately. They had endured sexual violence from soldiers during the march, and they had learned through brutal demonstration that resistance resulted in immediate and public execution. Upon arrival in Egypt, the systematic destruction of identity began with the branding process. This wasn't decorative tattooing, which free Egyptians practiced as religious expression or fashion. This was the literal branding of human beings like cattle, using heated metal to burn identification marks into flesh. Archaeological evidence from the Sita period, confirmed by both physical remains and documentary sources, shows that enslaved people bore marks consisting of their owner's name or an identifying symbol, typically burned into their upper arm or shoulder. The scars were permanent, visible, and intentional. They announced to anyone who saw them that this person was property, that they belonged to someone else, that they had no legal existence independent of their owner's will. The legal framework that governed enslaved women in ancient Egypt reveals a society that had thought deeply about how to maintain absolute control over human beings. Egyptian law codes, preserved in numerous papyri, explicitly categorized slaves as property rather than persons. This wasn't a casual distinction. It had profound implications for every aspect of an enslaved woman's existence. She could be bought, sold, traded, gifted, or bequeathed in wills exactly like furniture or livestock. The Wilbur Papyrus contains dozens of transactions recording the sale of women for prices that were calculated based on their age and physical condition, with values that placed them somewhere between cattle and luxury goods in the Egyptian economic hierarchy. But more significantly, enslaved women had no legal personhood, which meant they had no protection under Egyptian law. If a free Egyptian raped an enslaved woman, the crime wasn't assault, it was property damage. The legal remedy wasn't punishment of the perpetrator for violating a person, but compensation to the owner for diminishing the value of his property. The breeding facilities described in administrative documents represent perhaps the most calculated cruelty of Egyptian slavery. The papyrus Harris refers to settlements organized specifically for slave production, and administrative records from various temple complexes describe the management of these facilities with bureaucratic detachment. Women designated for breeding were housed in segregated quarters, their movements restricted, and their activities monitored by overseers whose job was to maximize reproductive output. They were forced to mate with men selected by their owners, sometimes fellow slaves, sometimes hired specifically for their physical characteristics, occasionally the owners themselves. Pregnancies were tracked by officials who maintained the same kind of records that farmers kept for livestock breeding. The children born in these facilities were legally slaves from birth, inheriting their mother's status regardless of their father's identity. This created what can only be described as hereditary slavery family lines that remained enslaved for generations, with administrative papyri tracking genealogies that documented human breeding programs lasting longer than most modern nations have existed. The conditions in these breeding facilities were deliberately harsh. Women were provided enough food to maintain basic health, but not enough to build strength that might enable resistance. They were housed in overcrowded quarters with minimal privacy and no personal possessions. Egyptian medical papyri describe the monitoring of pregnant slaves with clinical precision, noting complications and outcomes with the same tone used for agricultural reports. The mortality rate was high, childbirth in the ancient world was dangerous, even for wealthy women with access to the best medical care, and enslaved women received neither comfort nor particular concern for their survival. But the system was designed to be profitable, not humane, and dead women could be replaced with fresh captives from the next military campaign. The cruelty reached its apex in how the system treated mothers and children. Egyptian documents casually mention the practice of separating children from their mothers as soon as they could work independently, typically around age 7 or 8. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate policy designed to prevent the formation of family bonds that might create loyalty networks among slaves. Sexual exploitation permeated every aspect of female slavery in ancient Egypt, but it operated under a veneer of legal sophistication that made it appear bureaucratic rather than brutal. Egyptian law distinguished between different types of sexual violence based on the victim's legal status. The rape of a free woman was punishable by death tomb inscriptions, and legal papyri make this clear. But the rape of an enslaved woman was treated as property damage, with perpetrators facing fines equivalent to compensation for damaged goods. This legal framework didn't just permit the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, it actively encouraged it by removing all legal consequences for their abuse. Pharaohs and wealthy Egyptians maintained what the sources call harems, a term that sounds exotic, but describes what were essentially prisons for enslaved women kept for sexual purposes. These women lived in designated palace quarters or private homes, confined to specific areas and available for their owners' use at any time. Tomb paintings that appear to show beautiful women gracefully serving pharaohs aren't depicting honored wives or priestesses. They're showing sexual slaves whose entire existence was defined by their availability for exploitation. The archaeological evidence reveals that many women in these harems never left their designated quarters. They spent their entire lives in confinement, seeing the same walls year after year, their world reduced to the rooms where they waited to be summoned. Some developed relationships with other enslaved women or with the eunuchs who guarded them, but even these connections existed at their owner's sufferance and could be severed at any moment. The isolation was itself a form of torture. Humans are social beings, and the deliberate restriction of contact created psychological damage that compounded the trauma of sexual exploitation. Escape was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. Egyptian law explicitly stated that runaway slaves could be killed without trial by anyone who encountered them. Those who were recaptured faced punishments designed to serve as public warnings. Legal papyri describe escaped slaves being whipped, branded with additional marks to identify them as runners, or having limbs amputated to prevent future escape attempts. Some were executed publicly, buried alive, drowned in the Nile, or killed in ways designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. The Egyptians created an entire infrastructure dedicated to preventing slave escapes. Professional slave catchers operated throughout the kingdom, paid bounties for returning runaway property. Communities were required by law to report suspicious strangers who might be escaped slaves. Border officials maintained lists of missing slaves and had authority to detain anyone who couldn't prove their free status. The bureaucratic records show that the Egyptian government took slave control as seriously as border security, understanding that their entire economy depended on maintaining this system. The normalization of this brutality extended into every corner of Egyptian society in ways that reveal how completely a culture can internalize systematic cruelty. Egyptian children grew up seeing enslaved women as natural fixtures in their households, learning from infancy that some human beings existed solely for the benefit of others. Free women participated actively in the system, owning female slaves and directing their labor while benefiting from the elevated social status that slave ownership provided. The temple complexes, supposedly centers of spiritual purity, operated their own slave quarters and maintained breeding programs that supplied labor for religious institutions. Priests developed theological justifications for slavery, creating religious doctrines that explained why foreign women were naturally suited for servitude, claiming that the gods had created different types of humans for different purposes. These teachings were inscribed on temple walls and taught in Egyptian schools, providing divine sanction for treating enslaved women as subhuman property. The evidence for these practices comes overwhelmingly from the Egyptians' own records. They documented their exploitation with the same meticulous attention they brought to tracking grain harvests or construction projects. Temple inventories list enslaved women alongside furniture and livestock. Legal contracts treat the sale of human beings as routine business transactions. Administrative papyri describe the management of breeding facilities with the cold efficiency of corporate documents. The Egyptians weren't hiding their practices or ashamed of their system. They were proud of their organizational sophistication, and they preserved records that would allow future administrators to replicate their success. The medical papyri reveal yet another dimension of exploitation that sounds almost clinical, until you remember that the subjects were human beings. Egyptian physicians used enslaved women as experimental subjects for procedures that would never be attempted on free Egyptians. The surgical papyri describe operations performed without anesthesia or adequate tools, using slave women as practice subjects for techniques that might later be used on patients who mattered. The mortality rates from these procedures were documented with detachment, recorded as data points rather than tragedies. Some medical texts mention using enslaved women to test the effectiveness of poisons and antidotes, deliberate poisoning of human beings to determine lethal doses and evaluate potential treatments. The records describe these experiments with the same tone used for testing irrigation techniques or construction methods. Pregnancy became another avenue for medical exploitation. Egyptian medical texts describe forced abortions performed on enslaved women whose pregnancies didn't serve their owners' purposes. Women carrying children fathered by unauthorized partners faced termination of their pregnancies because mixed parentage complicated ownership rights and reduced the children's value. The procedures were performed without pain relief and with minimal concern for the woman's survival. The medical papyri track outcomes like experimental data, noting which methods were most effective at terminating pregnancies while keeping the woman alive enough to eventually resume productive labor. The living conditions in slave quarters, revealed through archaeological excavations at worker villages, show that the physical environment was deliberately designed to maintain maximum productivity while minimizing costs. Multiple women were crowded into structures smaller than modern prison cells, with no privacy, no personal space, and no protection from heat or cold. The diet provided to enslaved women was calculated with precision enough to maintain basic functionality but insufficient to build strength that might enable resistance. Analysis of bones from slave cemeteries reveals systematic malnutrition, stunted growth, and evidence of diseases that came from deliberate dietary restrictions. Egyptian officials understood exactly how little food a human being needed to remain alive and working, and they provided no more than that calculated minimum. For 3,000 years, an entire civilization normalized the complete dehumanization of captured women, creating industrial systems of exploitation that operated with bureaucratic efficiency across centuries. The pyramids still stand, the temples still draw tourists, the hieroglyphs still tell stories of pharaohs and gods. But beneath every monument, funding every architectural achievement, enabling every cultural flourishing was this: women whose names we'll never know, whose languages died with them, whose children were taken at birth, whose bodies were used until they broke and then replaced with fresh captives from the next military campaign. The evidence sits in climate-controlled archives now, preserved by the same dry air that mummified pharaohs. Papyri recording transactions, inscriptions listing captives, administrative documents describing breeding quotas. The Egyptians documented everything with a precision that makes denial impossible. They weren't ashamed, they were proud of their efficiency. And perhaps that's what lingers most uncomfortably, not just that such systematic cruelty existed, but that an entire civilization looked at it and saw not horror, but achievement, not exploitation, but order, not women suffering, but property being managed. The sand has buried many secrets, but this one the Egyptians themselves preserved, writing it down with the same care they used to record the names of kings, never imagining that future generations would read those records and recognize them not as evidence of civilization, but as its opposite,